guys, if this is your first time to my channel, hello and welcome. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Emily and today I am going to be bringing you guys some dupes from my collection on the Natasha Denona Sunset palette. So I know you're probably thinking, why the heck are you making a video on the Sunset palette like a year and a half after it originally came out? Well, I recently checked my DMs on Instagram and I had a DM from a subscriber of mine asking to see some comparisons to some shades that I already have in my collection, because I would assume that they probably want to pick up some similar shades to the Sunset palette, but they don't want to fork over $129, which is completely understandable and respectable. I still question my judgment and question myself as a person for actually shelling out the $129 for the frickin' Sunset palette. I still question that to this day. Every time I look at my Sunset palette, it mocks me a little bit and it just sits there in the corner of my makeup space just saying, hey, you bought me, you didn't need me, you spent way too much money on me, and now I'm here. It literally mocks me, and so for that reason, I don't even like to look at it. Like, I'm looking at you right now, Sunset palette, and I'm not feeling too great about owning this, but nonetheless, it's a freaking expensive palette. I find videos like this very helpful because sometimes you just don't want to go out and spend $130 on an eyeshadow palette. So I am all here for providing some dupes for you guys and for anyone who wants the palette and has wanted it for a while but does not want to go out and spend a bunch of money on it. I am all here for helping you guys save some freaking money, because I discovered a video similar to this after I had already bought the Sunset palette and I had had it in my collection for a while, and I just felt so bummed that I had spent so much money, and I don't ever want anyone else to feel like that, because it sucks knowing that you spent $130 on something that you did not really need to spend $130 on. You know what I mean? So for today's video, I'm going to be showing you guys the dupes that I have in my collection that are the most similar. Some of them are pretty spot on and some of them are kind of different but very similar and kind of have a similar vibe to the Sunset palette. Now, as I've said 100 times in this video already, and we're only 3 minutes in, I already own the Sunset palette, so I can compare my dupes to the actual palette itself so you can see up close and personal how close they really are. I'm also going to be including some bonus shades that I feel like would have worked in this palette really well and that I would have loved to have seen in this palette. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get right on into the dupes that I have in my collection. So before we get started, I just wanted to show you guys here what the Sunset palette looks like if you have never seen it before. But chances are you've probably seen this because a lot of people love it and a lot of people love to hate it. And I'm like right in the middle. I have a love-hate relationship with this guy. But these are what the colors in the palette look like, and now you kind of have a point of reference to the dupes that I'm going to be showing in just a moment. So here is all of the shades that I have picked out from my personal collection of single shadows that I feel like look the most similar to the Sunset palette. So the first shade in the Natasha Denona palette is called Atmosphere, and I would describe this shade as a metallic terracotta pink. So the shade out of my collection that I felt like represented Atmosphere the most is the shade Come and Get It by Colourpop. It is this beautiful kind of pinky, bronze, rose gold metallic shade. It's not an exact dupe to Atmosphere. Atmosphere is a little bit deeper and a little bit more terracotta, but I didn't really have anything in my single shadow collection that was a spot on dupe, so this was what I got that was the closest. The second shade in the Natasha Denona Sunset palette is called Sinai. It is this beautiful, rich, warm, orangey terracotta matte. So I decided to pop in Colourpop's Cannonball, which is a more terracotta orange shade. It's not quite as brown as Sinai from the Sunset palette, but I didn't have any super light colored brown terracotta shades in my collection, so I just opted out for a really deep kind of burnt orange shade, and I feel like in the swatches you'll see they are pretty close. And personally for me, I prefer a more orangey shade, so I like this shade a little bit better than the Natasha Denona one. The next shade in the Natasha Denona palette is the shade Ice Gold. Ice Gold is a satin white shade that has a sort of goldish hue to it. It's not super strong, and honestly I'm not a huge fan of this color because it's not super shiny and metallic and bright, and this is like the highlight shade of the palette, so you would think that it would be really bright and impactful and beautiful, but it's very soft and muted, and I'm just not really personally a fan of that. I can see the merit for it, and I can see why Natasha would put it in here, but I prefer something that's a little bit more like the shade that I picked out to dupe it. This is the shade Clutch Pearls, which is by Colored Raine. It's essentially the same exact color as Ice Gold. The shade has a white base with a gold shift to it, but Clutch Pearls is way more intense, way more in your face. You can use this as a face highlighter, as an inner corner highlight, lid shade, brow bone highlight, whatever you have it. It works in multiple different ways, and I'm a huge fan of the shade, and I personally like this one a little bit more than the Sunset palette. The next shade in the Natasha Denona Sunset palette is the shade Mandarin. This is a beautiful high shine, high foiled, orangey metallic shade. The shade is very unique and actually really hard to dupe, so I actually had to reach into my Colourpop Yes Please palette, which is infamously known for being the kind of dupe palette of the Natasha Denona Sunset palette. Now, this shade that I'm going to talk about here is sold in a single form now, so I feel comfortable recommending it to you guys because you don't have to go out and pick up the whole Yes Please palette to just get this specific shade. This is the shade Chauffeur, and Chauffeur was actually created to dupe out Mandarin. They are a very similar color, but Mandarin is just a little bit more shiny and a little bit more smooth. But, I mean, I paid $130 for the whole palette, so it better be a little bit more smooth than the $16 Colourpop palette. You know what I mean? But nonetheless, the shades are extremely similar, and they were meant to be. The last shade in the top row of the Sunset palette is called Bronzage. It's this beautiful, metallic, warm, kind of bronzy, deeper brown shade, but it has a little bit of a red base to it. So I decided to pull out Sydney Grace's Loose Change. This shade is very similar in tone and in texture, and in shine to the Natasha Denona shade. Loose Change might just be a tinge more coppery and a tinge more red, but it's very, very similar to the shade Bronzage. Moving right along to the second row in the Sunset palette, the next shade Natasha has put in is called Volcano. It is a mid-toned warm brown shade. And you'll notice a pattern with a lot of these shades in the Natasha Denona Sunset palette, that a lot of them are just like a hair different in tone, and there is a heck of a lot of matte browns. So I decided to opt out for Makeup Geek's Cocoa Bear here. This is a classic mid-toned warm brown shade, and I feel like it matches the color spot on to Volcano. Now, I know for a fact that I'm going to pronounce this next one wrong, but the next shade in the Natasha Denona palette is called Aubade or Aubade. I'm not 100% on that, and I'm sorry if it means something and I do not know the correct pronunciation. It is a gorgeous, super foiled, metallic, mid-toned bronze shade. And when I was looking through my single shadow collection, looking for a shade to dupe out the mid-toned bronze shade from the Sunset palette, I immediately thought of Looxi Beauty's Sunset Drive, which is this shade right here. Sunset Drive might just be a hair more pink, but they are extremely similar in tone. So now we are moving on to one of the most disappointing orange shades that I've ever used in my life, and I know that's a big statement and kind of a mean one, but I can't sugarcoat it and I can't lie to you guys. The shade Horizon from the Sunset palette, which is that matte orange that grabs your attention when you first see photos of the palette, is a huge letdown, and for that much money, it should not be letting you down. Horizon is not super pigmented, and you really have to build it up to get it to show up on your eyes. It blends away really easily. It doesn't have a good lasting power. I'm just not really a fan of Horizon. Now, I don't think that all of the Natasha Denona shadows are like that, especially the ones in the Sunset palette. Some of them are beautiful and formulated amazingly, but for some reason, the shade Horizon is just it's not good in my opinion. I don't know if I got a bad one. I think maybe I may have gotten a bad one because I have heard people say that it is the best damn orange that you will ever use in your life. But I know that there is someone out there that agrees with me because Jay Kissa, the YouTuber, said the same exact thing. She said that Horizon was not up to par, it was not pigmented, it was patchy, it fluffed away into nothing. And I was just like, thank you. I thought I was freaking insane. I thought I was the only person that was hating on that shade, and apparently I'm not. So makes me feel a little bit better, but not really, because that shade should be very good for the price tag. So for the dupe, I decided to choose Coastal Scents Dark Mango. Dark Mango is a little bit more pink and a little bit more vibrant, but they're very similar in tone, and Dark Mango has a lot more pigment, and this shade is literally 99 cents when they're on sale and $1.99 during the rest of the year when Coastal Scents does not have their 99-cent sale. So it's a heck of a lot cheaper. I think the color, personally, in my opinion, is a lot prettier than the more kind of yellowy, washed out orange that's in the Sunset palette. So I wanted to pop that guy in because I am a big fan of Dark Mango. So the next shade in the palette is Sundays, and it is a super beautiful foiled yellowy gold shade. Now, I do not have an exact dupe for this at all. I don't really own any single shadows that are gold. I have some gold shadows that are in other palettes, but I didn't want to pull in any shades from a palette because you can't buy the shadow on its own. You have to purchase the whole stinking palette, and I really want these recommendations to be achievable for you guys. So the shade I decided to pick was Touch of Glam Beauty's Sweet Nectar. Now, like I said, this shade is not a dupe. The level of intensity and shine and sparkle that is in Sweet Nectar by Touch of Glam Beauty is very comparable to the shade from the Natasha Denona palette. I wanted to choose a shade that was pretty close, but obviously I wasn't going to get to an exact shade. And I wanted to choose a shade that was as close as I could get to the Sunset palette. So this shade is a kind of pinky goldish base, and it has some green and gold flecks in it, and it is so beautiful. It is a duochrome shade, and I love it so much. It's super shiny, super bright, super intense, and it does remind me a lot of Sundays from the Natasha Denona palette. It's just not nearly as gold, but it will get you a similar vibe on the eyes. Not exact. I'm sorry, I couldn't find an exact dupe, but the formulas of these two shadows are extremely similar. The last shade in the second row of the Natasha Denona Sunset palette is called Terra, and it is a basic true matte warm brown shade. So I decided to pick out Sydney Grace Caramel Apple from my single shadow collection. This guy has been shown off many times on my channel, and I am a huge fan of the formulation and the pigmentation of the Sydney Grace matte shadows. Now, I'm not really a huge fan of browns at all, but if I were to choose a brown, this would be my kind of brown. It is very similar to the Natasha Denona shade, maybe just a little bit warmer, but I say that's a good thing. Now, my absolute favorite shade in the Natasha Denona Sunset palette is that very bland looking pink matte shade called Bermuda that is just hiding away in the corner of the palette. That is my favorite freaking shade from the Sunset palette. It is so perfectly pigmented, it is so blendable, so beautiful, it shows up so nicely on the skin as a transition shade or as a crease shade. I'm in love with it. It has a very unique undertone to it. It might look like a basic kind of peachy, nude, pinky shade, but it is so much more than that. It has a sort of salmon-y undertone to it that I can't really find anywhere else. And it is just a very unique, special, well-formulated shade. The closest that I had in my collection was the shade Secrets by Colourpop, which is right down here in the corner. As you can see, they are very similar in tone. Secrets is just a hair more baby pink, while Bermuda is a little bit more salmon toned, but you really won't be able to tell on the eye. Now, Colourpop does this thing where they just love to discontinue really amazing products all the time, and unfortunately they have discontinued Secrets, but they do currently have a matte kind of peachy baby pink shade on their website, which is called Hear Me Out, and to me they look visually very similar in tone. I know that Colourpop kind of does that sometimes. They'll discontinue a product or an eyeshadow shade or a lipstick shade and bring back a new one with the formula and the color just tweaked ever so slightly. It's essentially the same shade, but it's just a little bit different. So I think that Hear Me Out by Colourpop would work as a good alternative for issues if you can't get your paws on that guy. The second shade in the last row of the Sunset palette is called Morgana. It is a beautiful orangey red duochrome metallic, and I freaking love this shade. I don't have any complaints about this shade. It really is beautiful, but when I think about this shade, my mind immediately goes to Sydney Grace's Golden Peach, which is this little fella right down here. They're essentially the same shade. Golden Peach is a little bit brighter, and honestly, I like that. but they are so close in tone and in pigmentation and in shine that you really wouldn't be able to tell a difference on the eyes. So now we're moving on to that stunning eye-catching red that is in the Natasha Denona Sunset palette, and that is the shade Panjin. It is a beautiful, kind of muted, mid-toned primary red shade. The shade that I have in my collection that to me is the most similar to Panjin is the shade Ilithyia by Devinah Cosmetics, which is right down here in the center. As you can see, it's not a super bright and in-your-face red, but it still is a primary red matte. It's a little bit more muted and a little bit more tame than, say, Sugar Pills Love Plus or something that is more so of a Ronald McDonald red. I think it's beautiful, I think the colors are spot on, and I am a huge fan of both shades. The second to last shade in the bottom row of the Sunset palette is called Ingenious. What an ingenious name. That was a horrible joke. Moving on. Ingenious is a deepened, cool-toned brown shade. As you can see, we have a whole lot of browns in this palette. And my mind automatically went to Colourpop's Cloud 9, which is a deepened, cool-toned brown shade. They are literally spot-on dupes. You can't get more similar than this. Honestly, they perform the same on the eyes, they look the same, they swatch the same. They are essentially twins. And of course, if we're talking about the Sunset palette, we cannot forget that beautiful, warm, light-colored yellow shade, which is the shade Soul. Soul is one of my favorite shades in the entire palette. It's not super pigmented, so you can use it as a transition shade and not have it look too yellow, but you can build it up. It does build up really nicely, and you can get a very strong, bright yellow shade after just a couple layers on your eyes. I'm a huge fan of Soul from the Sunset palette, but the shade that I had that was the most similar in my collection is Sydney Grace's Geese Allaying. They are almost the same exact shade. They are both kind of like a muted, more toned down light yellow shade. Both shades are not super bright, but they do build up really nicely, and you can get a very pronounced yellow color on your eyes with just a few layers. But if you do want something more soft and diffused, both of these shades will do that for you. So those are all of the dupes that I have out of my personal single shadow collection that I wanted to show you guys. Like I said, they are not all exact dupes, but they are about as close as a girl can get to the Sunset palette out of what I already had in my collection. Now, if you didn't already notice, the Sunset palette has a whole heck of a lot of brown going on in this. Especially for something called a Sunset palette, you think there would be a little bit more color going on in this color scheme, but you really only get a few really nice, bright, colorful shades, and a lot of it is brown. I would say half of this palette is basic brown shades and different shades of brown, and for some people that might be totally awesome, but for my personal wants and needs out of a palette that is called the Sunset palette, I want something that is a little bit more vibrant and more colorful, and I want something that has a little bit more versatility to it. So I decided to pick out 4 beautiful, colorful shades that still have the sunset theme to it that I feel like would work really well with the rest of the palette. And of course, I would replace these with some of those kind of mid-tone browns, because no one needs that many mid-tone browns in one palette, especially for that much money. I want some unique shades. So I feel like these are the shades that were really kind of missing from the Sunset palette. I feel like these shades could really amp up the palette a little bit more and make it a little bit more unique, a little bit more versatile, and I feel like you could do a lot more looks if these types of shades were in the palette instead of some of those browns. So I feel like the palette was really missing a high shine foiled metallic yellow shade. You really only got one yellow shade in the palette, and I feel like for something called the Sunset palette, it should have some more yellows in it. That's just my personal opinion, but I don't know. Am I crazy for thinking that? I feel like the palette should have had more yellow shades, so I decided to choose out a metallic, bright, shiny, sunny yellow, and this yellow right up here is the shade Sunbeam, which is from Sydney Grace Cosmetics. The shade is so stinking beautiful. It is so bright, so vivid, so intense, but it's not so metallic that you couldn't use it in the crease. I have used this shade in the crease and have buffed it out, and have kind of buffed away some of the shimmer, and it becomes more of a satin when you do that. So you can layer it up with other different shades and use it almost like a matte. But it does still work really nicely as a shimmery lid shade as well. So it's a very versatile shade, it's very bright, it's very intense, and I really feel like the Natasha Denona palette was missing this guy. So obviously there is is a red in the Natasha Denona Sunset palette, which is the shade Panjin. Like I said earlier, it's more so of a muted kind of primary red. It's really beautiful and really pigmented and really blendable, and I do like the shade. I think the shade works nicely with the rest of the colors that she picked for the palette, but I feel like a really hot, almost pinkish red matte would have been really nice in the palette. You could use it with the yellow, you could use it with the orange. I feel like it would amp up the palette a little bit, so I decided to reach for Colourpop's Hop On, which is this beautiful kind of pinky red matte here. Staying on the topics of reds here, I feel like the Sunset palette could have really used a deep foiled, high shine, high impact red shade, so I decided to reach for Looxi Beauty's One Night Stand, which is this guy right down here. This would have been perfect in the palette. You could have gone for an orange in the crease, deepened everything up with Panjin, which is the more muted red shade, and popped this guy right over the lid, and you would have had a beautiful sunsetty red smoky eye. I feel like this would have been perfect in the palette, and I'm honestly surprised that we didn't see a really beautiful red metallic in the palette. And the last shade that I feel like would have been really beautiful in this palette is a gorgeous, warm, mid-toned purple matte. This is Colored Raine's Mothership, and this is the single shadow version of that beautiful kind of pinky purple matte from the Queen of Hearts palette from the Colored Raine line. This is a huge fan favorite amongst people who do buy from Colored Raine, and it's beautiful and it is well loved for a reason. This shade would have been perfect with the matte yellow, the matte orange, the matte red, whatever you have it. It would have been perfect with all of the shades that are in the Sunset palette already. I feel like you can't have a sunset without considering at least the purple shades of the sunset as well, because for me, when I think about sunsets, I think of yellow, orange, red, pink, and purple. So I don't really know where the pink and purple went in Natasha's mind, but for me personally, I feel like they need to be there if we're talking sunsets. So now we're gonna go ahead and get right on into some swatch comparisons for the dupes that I chose against the Natasha Denona Sunset palette. These will all be swatched on unprimed skin. I'm just gonna dip my finger into each pan of eyeshadow one time, and I'm just gonna build the layer of the swatch up 2 times so you can really see what the color actually looks like. So let's go ahead and hop right on into that. But that is going to be wrapping up my Natasha Denona Sunset Palette dupes video. Like I said, not all of these are 100% dupes, so please do not come for me saying that they're not 100%, because I know, they're not 100%, but they're the closest I could get in my collection. But I still wanted to make this video because it was requested, and I want to make helpful videos for you guys. So I really do hope that you were able to find this helpful in some way. I do hope that you consider subscribing if you have not already. I am doing all sorts of makeup goodness on this channel, so if you are not already subscribed and you would like to be, I would love to see you hit that button down below. I do hope that you also consider giving this video a big ol' thumbs up, and I do also hope that you consider hitting that notification bell down below if you do enjoy my videos. I hope you are having an absolutely amazing, fantastic, and fabulous day wherever you are, and thank you so much for watching. I hope to see you next time. Bye!